I have to warn you this morning that today's passage is one of the racier ones that's in the Bible. And of course, at Casa de Mañana, I don't have to worry about that. Everybody's above the age of consent. But I kind of went into a little panic this morning about whether the children were still going to be in the room, and I had to go look it up that they left for Sunday school before we could talk about this. So this is really a passage for adult ears. A few months ago, a new term was coined that quickly gained ground in social media. It started when Senator Elizabeth Warren attempted to read a letter written by Coretta Scott King, the widow of Martin Luther King, during hearings for a cabinet post. When she refused to stop reading it, even after being informed that she was breaking a rule against disparaging another member of the Senate voted for her to be removed from the podium. The explanation for this came from the male Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, who said, "She was warned, she was given an explanation. Nevertheless, she persisted." "Nevertheless, she persisted" became a rallying cry. It was posted alongside pictures of Rosa Parks and Malala Yousafzai, of Emmeline Parkhurst and Harriet Tubman, of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Mother Teresa, great women of history who have stood up for justice. It's been sold on t-shirts and jewelry and coffee mugs. It became the theme for fundraisers and marches, and hundreds of women, plus a few men, have had "Nevertheless, she persisted" tattooed on their bodies. Like them, God loves persistent women. In the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, and especially in Genesis, persistent women move God's story along. They protected the ancestral line that flowed from Abraham to David to Jesus. They rescued their menfolk. They shamed kings into providing justice, and they raised sons who advised and supported those kings. Women in the ancient world had, with very few exceptions, had no power, no money, no authority, and no physical strength. They depended on their husbands and their brothers and their fathers to provide for them. They could not work except for the destitute, who resorted, as some women do today, to prostitution. They could not be educated, testify in court, or live on their own. But we have many, many stories of women who used their intelligence and their cunning and their persistence instead of strength. Rebecca, Leah, Rahab, Ruth, Abigail, and many others schemed and persisted. Without them, the royal line would have died out. This morning, we're going to be talking about the first of 3 Tamars in the Old Testament. The name means palm tree, and it's the same word that's used for Judge Deborah for the tree that she sat on as she held court. So in many ways, Tamar means seat of feminine justice. And that's just what this Tamar, the daughter-in-law of Judah, achieved. Listen now for the word of the Lord as it comes to us from the book of Genesis, chapter 38, beginning in verse 1. It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and settled near a certain Adullamite whose name was Horah. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. He married her and went into her. She conceived and bore a son and named him Again she conceived and bore a son who she named Onan. Yet again she bore a son and she named him Shelah. She was in Kezib when she bore him. Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law. Raise up offspring for your brother." But since Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, he spilled his seed on the ground whenever he went into his brother's wife, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. What he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, and God put him to death also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up." For he feared that Shelah too would die like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah's time of mourning was up, he went up to Timnah to the sheep shearers, he and his friend Hurrah the Adullamite. When Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep," she put off her widow's garments, put on a veil, wrapped herself up, and sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. She saw that Shelah was grown up, yet she had not been given to him in marriage. When Judah saw her, he thought her to be a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He went over to her at the roadside and said, "Let me come in to you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me that you may come in to me?" And he answered, "I will give you a kid from the flock." And she said, "Only if you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your signet and your cord and the staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went in to her, and she conceived by him. Then she got up and went away. Taking off her veil, she put on the garments of widowhood. Then Judah sent the kid by his friend the Adullamite to recover the pledge from the woman, but he could not find her. He asked the townspeople, "Where is the temple prostitute who was at Enaim by the wayside?" But they said, "No prostitute has been here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I have not found her. Moreover, the townspeople said, 'No prostitute has been here.'" Judah replied, "Let her keep the things as her own. Otherwise, we will be laughed at. You see, I sent this kid, and you could not find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the whore. Moreover, she is pregnant as a result of whoredom." And Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." And as she was being brought up, she sent word to her father-in-law, "It was the owner of these who made me pregnant." And she said, "Take note, please, whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff." Then Judah acknowledged them and said, "She is more in the right than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." And he did not lie with her again. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Will you pray with me? Lord, as we study your word this morning, let the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Looking at this story through modern eyes, it seems like it's all about sexual sin. After all, Judah hired a prostitute, Tamar dressed like a prostitute and committed incest with her father-in-law, and Onan was smitten by God for spilling his seed. But actually, through the lens of its own time, that's not what the story's about at all. It's about broken promises, a woman's right, and protecting the line of David. It's significant where this story is placed in the Bible. It suddenly interrupts the story of Joseph towards the end of Genesis, and it doesn't seem to belong there. But the editors of Genesis, who put a whole lot of oral tradition and written writings into one cohesive history, knew what they were doing. They had a reason for putting it right there. Judah's father was Jacob, the grandson of Abraham. Jacob had 4 wives, 12 sons, and 1 daughter, and eventually settled down to raise sheep and goats in Canaan, which is modern-day Israel. Judah was Jacob's 4th son, but along with all the other 10 of the oldest brothers, was overlooked by his father. Jacob loved his 11th son best. That son's name was Joseph, and although he was a very moral and soft-hearted guy, he literally drove his brothers to murder. He had dreams. In his dreams, his older, smarter, stronger brothers bowed down to him, a 17-year-old daddy's boy. And he tattled on them too, blithely unaware of the rage his words and actions caused. When the brothers had enough, they schemed to get rid of him, to push him into a ditch in the ground and leave him to die in the hot desert sun. But Judah was the one who suggested that they sell him into slavery instead, saving Joseph's life and earning a tidy little payment in return. That seemed to be Judah's style, doing something good but still managing to reward himself for it. The story of Tamar begins immediately after that. Judah left his brothers and settled in the south, marrying a Canaanite woman and befriending a man named Hirah. There's 3 strikes against him. He lived in a Gentile land, he married a Gentile wife, and he had a Gentile as his closest friend, and one with a name that just means he just had to be a bad influence, Hirah. His parents would have despaired of him. Judah's wife, who is not named, bore him 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. The oldest, married a woman named Tamar, and it's not clear in the Bible whether she was an Israelite or a Canaanite. Was wicked in the sight of the Lord. We don't know what he did wrong, but his name means watcher. So maybe he was a spy or a blackmailer or even a peeping Tom. Either way, God put him to death. So Judah told Onan, his second son, "Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law. Raise up offspring for your brother." Now this is the strange and ancient custom of Levirate marriage. The name comes from the Hebrew word lever, which means a husband's brother. It was common practice in much of the ancient world, but it was also codified in the Hebrew law in the book of Deuteronomy. The death of a married, childless man created 2 problems. Who would carry on his line and take care of his property and possessions, and what would happen to his widow? Levirate marriage solved the problem. It set aside the laws against sex between in-laws, which was considered incest, and allowed a man to impregnate his brother's widow strictly for the purpose of creating an heir for the dead man. The woman would then have a child to care for, and who in return would care for her. And Judah's arrangement created a place for Tamar. But Onan was reluctant to obey his father and do his duty by Tamar. He would spill his seed on the ground whenever he went into his brother's wife, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. More likely, he wanted the inheritance for himself. When Judah died, his estate would have been split 4 ways, half to the oldest son and 1/4 to each of the others. But if the eldest, left no heirs, Onan, the second brother, would get 2/3 of the estate. And also notice that he didn't refuse to have sex with Tamar. He could have remained celibate or left her alone, but instead he had sex with her, but denied her a child. God was not happy. Onan was put to death too. Now Judah was unaware that God was behind the death of his first 2 sons, and so understandably, he believed that Tamar was some sort of black widow, a curse, and that she would cause the death of his 3rd son as well, who was also required to give her a child. Since he was too young to marry, Judah sent Tamar back to her father and asked her to wait until Shelah matured. But there was another solution to this problem which Judah chose to ignore. According to Levirate law, if a man had no son over 10 years old, he could perform the Levirate obligation himself. If he chose not to do so, the woman would be declared a widow, free to marry again. Judah could have set Tamar free, but he didn't. He sent her to live as a betrothed widow in her father's house, pledged to marry a child. Unlike other widows, she could not remarry, and she must stay chaste. She was in limbo. And Judah had no intention of keeping his promises. Judah's wife eventually died. When his time of mourning was over, perhaps a year, he went to Timnah to the annual sheep shearing. This would have been a wild time, kind of like a rodeo. Men only, probably celebrated with lots of drinking and partying. When Tamar heard of this, she put off her widow's garments, put on a veil, wrapped herself up, and sat at the entrance to Enaim, right smack on the road to the sheep shearing. There, the full burden of her situation smacked her over the head when she saw her future husband had indeed become a man. How did she feel when she saw Shelah all grown up? Angry, humiliated, afraid, determined, hopeless? Probably a mix of all of those. But it didn't take long for her to come up with a solution to all of her problems. Was Tamar waiting on the side of the road in a veil so that Judah wouldn't recognize her? Or was it already part of her scheme to pretend to be a prostitute? The Bible doesn't say, and Tamar doesn't speak in the story. But Tamar certainly took advantage of the situation. Judah saw her and didn't hesitate to strike a deal. It seems clear he had done this before. "Let me come into you," he told her, and she agreed for the price of one goat kid. Judah did not happen to have a baby goat on his person, so she demanded a pledge, and Judah gave her 3 items, his signet, his cord, and his staff. A signet was a clay cylinder used in the making of contracts. Each had some sort of unique design carved into it, and when a contract was made, hot wax would be poured on it, and the cylinder would be rolled in the wax, leaving an unmistakable impression. We do the same today sometimes, using wax to seal letters. But all 3 of those items were significant. The seal was a symbol of Judah's identity. The cord, which he would have worn around his neck to hold the seal, was a sign of his integrity because it kept his identity in place. And the staff, which was a large walking stick with all sorts of uses, was a sign of power. Judah handed all of these over for a quick roll in the hay, and Tamar conceived by him. Then she got up and went away. Taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. Now Judah did attempt to fulfill his pledge. He sent his friend Hurrah to trade a baby goat for the seal and the staff, but Hurrah couldn't find Tamar. Judah was afraid of being laughed at, so he let the matter drop. I'm not sure how he managed without those 3 symbols, but he seems to have forgotten the whole episode. But then, 3 months later, he heard, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the whore. Moreover, she is pregnant as a result of whoredom." Judah appeared to be furious and indignant at this stain upon his family's honor. But I think he was secretly gleeful. Tamar was a problem. He could not marry her to his final son for fear that she would somehow cause his death. But as long as she was alive, she and Shelah were pledged to marry. Neither one could marry another. A chance to get rid of Tamar had fallen right into his lap. Ironically, because Shelah was engaged to her, Tamar's sin was not fornication, but adultery. So Judah was able to demand the worst punishment available, not stoning or beating, but death by burning. He could get rid of this problem once and for all. But then Tamar suddenly turned the tables on him. She sent Judah the signet and the cord and the staff and said, "It was the owner of these who made me pregnant." Judah, to his credit, immediately acknowledged the items. You can just imagine today what kind of forensic science it would take to figure out that those actually belonged to him. And he admitted that the child she would bear was his, legally the heir of Ur. And he credited Tamar's actions. She is more in the right than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." His behavior was good, but Tamar's was better. She did not humiliate him in public, but quietly demanded her rights. She had an opportunity to get even for years of delay and deceit, but she didn't even make an accusation, just a simple statement. Her persistence paid off. Judah rewarded her by giving her back her proper status as a widow who was free to remarry. God rewarded her with twin sons, one of whom, Perez, who, like all Bible stories, was the youngest, would be an ancestor of both David and Jesus. According to the customs of her time, Tamar's actions were righteous and just. She was persistent, clever, and effective. But she was also loyal to her first husband's family, like Ruth, who would one day marry one of her descendants. In her quiet and persistent way, Tamar, the straight palm of justice, fought for her rights and gave birth to David's royal line. Amen.